Okay, this tutorial I want to take a look at Nuke, introduce you guys to just some very basic setup controls just to start looking at your images, maybe get them working together. This will probably be in two pieces, but this first one is supposed to just kind of how to navigate Nuke and how to get your images in here and take a look at them. Okay, so this is Nuke. By default, you'll have a new composition when you open it. Nuke has a non-commercial free version. So when you download and install Nuke, just make sure usually you'll get a pop-up window that asks you or tells you that you are, or asks you for a license or something like that. But usually there's a button in the bottom right-hand side that says start in non-commercial mode. So let's go ahead and just start Nuke. Right, so it even has a non-commercial version, but even if you start with normal Nuke, you'll have a license error. Just say start in non-commercial mode or in C mode. Okay. The non-commercial mode has a size limitation, so you can see this is a non-commercial version. So you have a 1920 by 1080 size limitation, which is fine for us because we probably aren't going to go higher than 1080 HD. Okay, so here we are. This is usually what your first scene looks like. Okay, up here we have the viewer, which is going to be essentially the visual representation of all of our images and all of our nodes compiled together. Down here we have the workspace. So we have the node graph, which is how we attach and rearrange and mix together our nodes and images and our render passes. We have the curve editor, which is just like the animation curve editor in most other programs, where if you animate anything within Nuke, like an object sliding across the screen or dialing in the brightness of a fake light that you're adding or comping in, then you can just use this to play with the tangents. And then a dope sheet, just like any other dope sheet, is going to have the actual keyframes, and we can pull them around. Okay. Right here is our time slider. So this is just obviously as like any other time slider you've seen. This one is just going to control where we're looking at in our animation, especially if we're looking at a sequence of images compiled together. Over here in the properties panel is going to be where we see the settings for our nodes, right? So if I add any node, like let's say I add the color correct node, you'll see I have all my settings over here, right? Okay. Let's go ahead and I'm going to open up my previous file just so we have some stuff, and then I'll show you how to drop in and add stuff as we go along, but I think it'll be easier for me to talk about with some stuff already on the screen. Okay, so up in our image, in our viewport up here, I'll pull this down, our viewer, we have quite a few settings that we can work with. So the first ones that I think are most important to understand is how you are interpreting the channels that you're feeding into the viewer. Okay, so by default, the viewer is focusing on your RGBA channels channel, and it's also going to be looking at the individual specific channels. So usually, by default, it's going to be RGBA for red, green, blue, alpha, RGBA.alpha, and then you're looking at the red, green, and blue channels at the same time, right? Over here, underneath this third drop-down, I can isolate and look at a very specific channel, like the red channel, green channel, blue channel, alpha, right? Let's set that back to RGBA. And then over here, if you have other passes, so for instance, if you're selecting a node that has a bunch of render passes plugged into it, you could select those as well. So right now I just have, for this one, my red, green, blue channel, essentially my color channel, and then my alpha channel, right? What your file comes in with by default might be very different, right? It might not start off showing your beauty image in your RGBA render pass per channel, right? So if I look at this one, this is actually, let me look at this one right here. So I'm reading in one of my EXRs from RenderMan that I exported that has all of my render passes packed into it. And this file has a lot of different channels to select from. So you can see when I'm looking at this one with the viewer, and we'll talk about how to do that later, you can see this drop-down menu now has all those render passes I set up, right? So I have my my beauty pass with just the environment light, my beauty pass just with the key light, the rim light, my normal beauty pass, my albedo, my direct diffuse, right? So I could use any of these guys to mix together. Okay. By default, most of the time you're going to want to switch it back to RGBA. So just keep that in mind. If you're trying to see what's inside of your one of your inputs or your files, so I can go up here and I can see I have my mat ID 0 and my mat ID 1. If I want to see what those look like, right? I can come up here and easily select that without having to use another node to interpret it. But I just have to always make sure I want to switch back to RGBA when I'm done doing that. Also, keep in mind that when you're looking at any of these images, if you want to understand where those color channels are or what's inside there, you can always use the mouse and hover over it, and there is essentially a color picker information down here that's going to tell you where your mouse is currently highlighted over and what its current attributes are in the red, green, blue, and alpha channels. Okay. So most passes are going to be color images. So primarily most passes are going to be color images, red, green, blue, sometimes alpha. Some passes have different information. So for instance, like the depth pass is going to have Z data in it instead of red, green, blue. A lot of times what happens is, like for instance, if I look at the shuffle node, you can see this might look really fancy right now, but you can see on the left-hand side, here's the pass I've selected. So if I change that pass to like my depth pass, you see it doesn't have a red, green, blue channel. It has a Z depth channel. And then something like DPD time has X, Y, Z. And then alpha has obviously an alpha pass, right? So some of these passes might have very different settings or channels associated with them. But it's what's happening most of the time when we're looking at this. Let me go ahead and set this back to, I don't even remember what I had it at, beauty probably. Okay, I think that was it. I'm not sure if it was. But if I come back and I want to look at this input right here and I want to see what the different channels look like, you'll see when I go to my depth pass, you can see it has red information. You see it has red channel information. And the reason why that is because if I can't normally view like X, Y, Z or Z depth or A or W, whatever that channel information wants to store in there, it's the viewer is going to do by default is it's just going to feed that into the color channels. So if I look at the DPD time, the one that had X, Y, Z, you'll see this has red, green, and blue information. It's just storing the X information in red, the green information in Y, and the blue information in or the Z information in blue. So it's still going to show them these different attributes as colors because it's just feeding them into red, green, and blue. And that's just for a visual sake. When we're plugging into nodes and we're actually like calculating things, it's not going to be treating them as red, green, and blue information unless we want it to, which we can define. Okay, so this is the viewport in a nutshell. It's just going to be a viewing of our current image that we're looking at. Inside here, so I said this is really helpful for understanding what we're looking at and what our information has. So just for a great example here is, by default, black is 0 and white is 1, right? Like if I look at, let's go back to RGBA. And let's look at something else here, right? So you can see here, this has the red, green, and blue channels. When they're all at 1, it's white. And then when they're all at 0, it's black, okay? But you can see here when I look at if I go back over here and look at my DPD time channel, right? You can see here if I select this, I'm getting negative values, which is interesting because that's less than black. And then if I look at my Z depth pass, right? Let's go to depth pass. You'll see this is red, and if it's fully red, red should just be 1. But you can see these values are going higher. So this color picker analyzer tool down here lets me go ahead and scan over my object, and it can tell me more information about my pass, right? So that's really helpful for the Z-depth pass because I might think my Z-depth pass is broken, right? Like, why can't I see anything? Why is it just red? And I can see in here, oh, it's the value in the red channel is actually changing. It's just the fact that the values are over 1 means everything's being crushed to just flat red, right? So if I went in here and I used a, let's take a look at it over here. I think I have it set up, right? So over here, let's go ahead and set that to RGBA. I've assigned my Z depth paths into red, green, and blue channels. So again, you can see those values changing as I hover my mouse over it down here. But we still can't see anything because everything's being clamped to white once it's higher than 1. And now when I bring a color correct on here to bring the value range down, you can see now these values are more within that 0 to 1 range, right? You see over here it's going to infinite because there's nothing in the scene, so the camera is shooting a distance that doesn't stop, so that's why we get infinite. Because remember the Z depth pass from one of our previous videos, we talked about the Z depth pass being the distance from the camera to the object, or a point on the object. Okay, so understanding this viewport color picker analyzer tool and understanding what color channels you're looking for can be really, really helpful for just reading your image and knowing what came into Nuke. Okay, in order to use this tool, this color picker, by default it should be on here. There's also a button up here for click toggle viewer info bar. So it's gonna, if it's not showing up there, just click on that little color picker, right? Sometimes you might accidentally lock it, right? Which is when you hold Control and left click. And so what that does is it samples a point and samples a color. So you can use that color and use it in somewhere else. If you don't want that, you just hold Control and right click and it'll free it up again, and now it's attached to your mouse location. Okay? All right. So that's the basics of the viewer. Just as any other program, getting used to zooming, panning, scaling, things like that is just a matter of just playing around with the mouse. It's basically middle mouse click and then scroll button. You can also right click to enable some settings. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at the workspace or our node graph. Okay. So by default, you'll usually just have, let me just pull this off. You'll have just an empty space. I'm pretending because I have all this other stuff up here. You have this empty space, and then you have a viewer node. As soon as you want to, and let's go ahead and I'm dragging the wrong viewer. Let's get rid of this one. Let's grab this guy. Okay. All right. So by default, you'll have an empty space in your viewer. So the easiest way to drop in images or your files to take a look at is you just navigate to wherever your file is. So let me go ahead and find mine, right? So in this case, I'm dropping in a single EXR image. You just drop it in, and it's going to use what's called a read node. Okay, so a read node is going to be essentially just a file reader for images and videos. Okay, so by default, if you just drop in a single image, it's going to use a single image. But you'll notice if you use this, if you want to, most of the time, if you're rendering from RenderMan, or if you send a render off to the render farm and get your files back, you're not getting a video back, you're getting an image sequence. So a sequence of images that when put together and looked at becomes a video, okay? So if I come up in here, you can see right here there's a button called sequences. So what it's going to do is if there is several files that have numeric order to them, so it goes from like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then what's going to happen is if you click sequences, it will show those items as something like this. Let me go ahead and see if I can zoom this in. Zoom. Nope, wrong button. Zoom. Okay, so you can see that right there. Passes to, when I click on sequences, you'll see it does passes number.exr 1 to 2. Right? The reason why it's doing that is because I have a passes 1 file and a passes 2 file. So it's gonna, if it sees like names that have the same name but with numbers to them, then what it's going to do is it's going to automatically try to create like a sequence to them in the naming convention. So let me see if I can find one of my other files. Let's see, images, shot 1. Let's see, I thought I had one. I hope I do. Images. Okay. So I'm going to cancel this for a second. I'm going to go ahead and drop in another file. So this is a CryptoMat image, and you'll see when I dropped it in, I have this CryptoMat 0.0109, so it's from frame 109, right? .exr. So if I open that up, you'll see I have all these images in here, right? And then when I click on use sequences, you'll see it's actually going ahead and grouping them and listing them in order. So I have my cryptomat file from frame 1 to 109, and I can click on that, and now it's reading in a sequence of images. So let me go ahead and quickly add my cryptomat to this. Okay, and you'll see up here, if I scrub through the this playback bar, the reason why it's showing there's no such file here is because I've rendered every 10 frames. So it should be, or every 12 frames, sorry, 12 frames. So every 12 frames, there's a file. So in this case, I'm missing files. So if you have your whole image sequence, then you shouldn't get that red error that's like missing a file. And the reason why it is because it's just feeding the frame number into that naming convention. And since cryptomat.002 doesn't exist, then it's not going to look for that, right? So don't worry about that, but you can see it's bringing in a series of images and matching them to the right frame number. Okay. All right, let me go ahead and get rid of that. Okay, so in order to look at our images, what we're going to do is we drop in our file, right, our EXR file. To attach it, you can click and drag, so any node is going to have arrows you can drag off, right? So the viewer node is going to have numbers that come off of it. So if I put that there, and let's say I put another file, like let's say I drop in this file right here, I can drag this one as well down there. And you'll see I can actually drag up to 10 different images to attach and look at the viewer. And these numbers actually correspond to the numbers of your keyboard. So if I press 1, I'm looking at the passes to EXR, and I press 2, you'll see I'm looking at this other file that I brought in, right? What I can also do is if I drag off of those, I can select the current node that I want to look at, and I can just press a number on the keyboard, and it's going to attach the viewer to it with that number. So if I click on this and I press 4, you'll see it attached that number 4 arrow to it. So if I'm like working in a really complex area, right, or a complex node structure, this isn't that complex, but I want to look at what this looks like. I can press 1 here, and then I can press, or maybe I want to see what the node looks like by itself before I start doing some manipulations to it. And this is when I composite them together, right? And so right here, I select this node, press 1, and then I select this other node, press 2. And so now when I press 1 and 2, it's going to swap back and forth between those two visuals, right? Looking at those two different nodes, okay? All right, let's come back down to here. I'm going to get rid of those. Okay, so now and what we can start to do from here is once we drop in our, before I move on to anything else, let's go ahead and talk about the properties panel. Okay, so whenever I drop in a new node, like let's say I want to drop in a color correct node, right? You'll see that settings for that will pop up over here, right? And as I add more nodes and more nodes and more nodes, let's do merge node, right? You're going to get this list of nodes in essentially descending order based on how old they are. So it starts off with the newest node, second oldest, right? So if this gets really complicated to look at, what you can always do is you can click on this right here, which is remove all panels from the control panel bin. So I'll clear them all out. You can also limit how many are visible at one time, right? So if I add more in here, it's not going to keep adding. It's not going to create a list of them. It's just going to show the one I have currently selected, right? I'm just going to leave this to 10 for now. You can double click on a node to refocus it into your properties panel. So if you just double click on a node, it's going to show you the settings for it again, even if you clear it up, or even if it's in a list, right? So if I have this big list over here, grade was the first one I selected, which is way down here. But if I have this big list, if I just want to bring grade back up to the top, I can just double click on it. Now grade is back up to the top, okay? And I'm just going to click on that to get rid of that. If you want to see your project settings, which are going to be like your global settings, like resolution and things like that for your file. So for instance, if I bring in a roto node, oh, I spelled that, roto node. Like for instance, what you can see on your roto node, let's take a look at that. It's got a 2K super 35 resolution, which is 2048 by 1556. But you'll notice my file size is 960 by 540. So what's going to happen is the viewer node is going to match its resolution, or the viewer is going to match its resolution to whatever is being fed into it. And if something doesn't have a resolution by default, it's just going to inherit your project settings resolution. So if I come over and press S to bring up my project settings, you'll see here I have full size format, which is like essentially my default format if I don't have any images that have a format attached to them, right? So I can bring this to HD 1080, or right now I'm using HD 540, which is I have to refresh myself, but I think that's 540 by 960. So what I can do here is I don't under my project settings, I'm going to press S on the keyboard to bring it back up. That's not in here, right? They don't have HD 540 right now, so I can just do a new one, and we'll do 960 by 540. Okay? We can call this HD 540. It could be whatever you want. Okay? Right? And so now I have, these guys are the same size. This isn't always necessary, but if you ever need to change that, you can change it in here. You can change the frame range. So again, by default, if you have like an image sequence, so let's go ahead and drop in that crypto mat again. Take a look at it, double click on the read node, and let's go ahead and find that image sequence. Okay. So by default, actually, it's not. It's what it's doing is it's setting the frame range for your file to whatever's last been fed into the viewer node. So right now, what happens is my image sequence goes from frame 1 to 109. So if I press S to look at my project settings, you'll see the frame range is from 1 to 109, right? Let's try to change that. So if it's 1 to 300, right? And let's turn off lock range. See if that works. Oh, okay. I do not understand the frame range settings as well as I thought. But by default, sometimes it's going to go ahead and change that last frame in that frame range based on whatever you're reading in for your image sequence. So sometimes that can get locked in, and if you don't like that, you can always come into the project settings and set that for your project. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and close the project settings for now. So let's talk a little bit more about actually connecting things and creating things inside of, oops, let me bring back that viewer node. Okay, inside of here, right? So we talked about just dropping in files, right? We talked about looking at files, like essentially manipulating the viewer to understand what's inside of our image. And so in order to create new nodes that we want to work with, what we can do is we can either find them on the left-hand side panel. So this is going to have all of our nodes separated into different panels, right? So I can click on this little transform and find the transform node. It's going to drop it in here. You can also use right-click, and so it's going to have the same files or menus over here. So especially if you know kind of what you want, but you don't know what it's called, so you know it's in the color area, right? So like, let's say you want to do color clamping. You're like, oh, clamp, right. Click on that, creates it, right? So you can just right-click in here and choose it. Just press delete to get rid of it. I can also press tab if you know what the name is. This is kind of my preferred because once I know the nodes I want, I can just go in here and press tab to bring this prompt up, and just type them in, right? And drop it in. Okay. The nodes, so let me go ahead and I'm going to use a shuffle node because we talked about color channels. So let's go ahead and take a look at that because that's actually a pretty useful node for adding together and separating and rearranging your color channels or your color passes. Okay, so I'm going to press the tab button and type in shuffle. Right, click on that. Okay, and so most nodes are going to have an input pipe and an output pipe. Okay, so an input pipe is going to be essentially something you're feeding into this node to do something to. If you're not familiar with node hierarchies or essentially creating structures and trees with nodes, this might be a little confusing at first, but after a while it gets pretty straightforward. Essentially, every node is going to have, let's do a merge node, let's do a defocus node, right? They're all going to expect certain inputs so they can do their proper operations, right? So this one right here just needs an image, right? And then it'll output an image, right? This one right here wants two images, right? A merge node is going to merge multiple images together, right? So it wants to combine two images together, so it has an A and B input, right? This node right here has an image and then a filter, because the way that this blur node, the defocus node that blurs your image, is it sometimes wants a filter image to change the shape and look of the blur, right? But it's also wants an image, right? And it's going to output an image. Okay. Some of your nodes also have one on the right-hand side, and this, as you drag out, you'll see is a mask. So if you want to do an operation or change something, for instance, like a color correct node, right? You'll have an image coming in, and you want to color correct it, and you put it out, but you don't want to do it on the entire image. So let's go ahead and I'm going to quickly change this to the beauty pass. Does this actually have the beauty pass? Am I looking at RGBA? Let's take a look at this. Beauty pass. What am I doing wrong? Let me go ahead and pause it really quickly while I fix myself. Okay, I figured it out. Essentially, I was trying to look at something that wasn't in the right channels, which I just fixed with the shuffle node, which we'll talk about in a second. But before that, let's talk about the mask. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull one of my masks over. So I have this mask right here. Actually, let's go ahead and use this mask right here. Okay, I'm going to drop this down here. So I have a mask pulled out. I just shuffled it out of my, again, we'll talk about shuffles in a little bit, but we're going to drag. So I have this color correct node. So this color correct node has that input, right? So it wants an image input. So we're taking that image as an input. I'm looking at the color correct node, so I just selected the color correct node and pressed 1, right? As opposed to looking at any other nodes, right? So I can come over here, and on this color correct node, I can just play with some of these color correct settings, and let me set that back to RGBA. There we go, right? And so you can see here, it's changing that whole image, right? But I could use a mask image, and I can plug that mask image and feed in something else as a mask, right? Let me set this to RGBA red. Okay. So come back to this color correct node, and now you'll see, you know, I'm feeding in this mask right here, and I can now color correct whatever I'm masking out with that mask node. Okay. So those are the basics of the input and output pipes for these nodes. Okay. It's really easy to connect them, right? You just click and drag that node onto another node, right? So a mask, it's automatically going to take the output of that node and make it the mask, right? If I drag the mask from here, I want to make the output of something else be the mask of this one, right? Or I can just drag the inputs up off of it, right? So I can either disconnect it, like if I want the output of the shuffle to be attaching here, I can click on it down here, attach it over here. Or if I want the input of the color correct to be something else, I can click on the top of that arrow, right? So that changes what I'm disconnecting and reconnecting to. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the shuffle node, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and, actually, let me take a look at this one more thing. So a really handy tool as well for testing your images is we can, right, if I wanna see what it looks like before and after I did my color corrections, right, I could always select the node before the color correction, press 1 to view it with the viewer, right, or 2, or really any number. And then I could press a different number for my color correct, and I can swap back and forth by pressing those keys, right? So I selected shuffle 26, pressed 1 to attach the 1 arrow to it, and I grabbed color correct, and I pressed 2 to attach the 2 arrow. And then now when I click back and forth on 1 and 2, I can see I'm jumping back and forth between 1 and 2. Okay. Another thing you can do is I'm going to select this guy and press 1, so I'm only looking at the color corrected node. Is an easier thing to do is if you, instead of having to select or set up those viewers, I can just press the D key on my keyboard to disable. You'll see it gets an X through it. So you can see here, that's an easy way of seeing what you're currently working on, what it looks like before and after without that node. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and now we can take a look at the shuffle node. I'm going to disable this node right here for now. Okay. All right, so the shuffle node, what it's going to do is it's going to take your input image, so my input file, right? And you can specify which channel you want to export, okay? So by default, let's take a look at this guy again, right? So I'm taking a look at this read node again. So by default, my read node, your channels are going to be kind of mixed together in a bunch of different layers in a different special order. Okay, so by default, my RGBA layer sometimes it comes in with color information, like you can see your beauty layer, but sometimes your beauty layer is actually on a different layer. So most likely, because of how I set up my render passes in RenderMan, some other channel is getting shuffled or squeezed into the RGBA default pass, and so now I can't see my normal image, right? So that can be kind of frustrating and confusing at first. So understanding how to look at these channels and shuffle them out can be really handy, right? So if I click on this list, I can see I have a beauty layer. You'll see, oh, there's my default RGBA pass, my normal beauty pass, which is almost always your default pass, right? But in some cases, depending on how you set up your render passes, it might not be your default pass. Okay? So, right, we can come in here and we can isolate and look at any of our render passes, right? But remember, this is just us viewing that. This isn't actually setting this file to being selecting this, right? So when I attach this file to, or this node right here to a bunch of different nodes, it's not only going to be showing the wood, it's going to be showing whatever the default is, which is this RGBA, in my case, which is black, right? Okay, so let's take a look at the shuffle node again. Okay, so the shuffle node, what that's going to do is, by default, it's going to have your RGBA, it's going to take your input list, and it's going to plug it into the output, right? So what I can do is, if I want to override or change my RGBA to a different pass, right? So my red, green, blue, my default color and alpha image, if I want to be that, have my beauty pass be my default image layer, what I can do is I can select from this input list, just like I could up here, I can come over here and then find that pass, right? So let's say I want my beauty pass, okay? And then what I can do is now I need to connect it to whatever color channels I want, right? So obviously it's easy in this case because we have our red channel, we want to plug it to our red channel, or our green channel, we want to plug it to our green channel. We have our blue channel, we want to plug it to our blue channel, right? Sometimes it's not as easy as that, right? So sometimes you'll see like your DPD time, right? It's got my X, Y, and Z, so it's not as obvious, but in this case, for DPD time, it's actually pretty easy. In this case, it's not showing up, right? Maybe because this file doesn't have a, what's it called, vector DPD image to it. I'm not 100% sure, but what it should be showing is it should be showing me my render pass. Let me go ahead and take a look at this and make sure my, okay, so this one doesn't have a DPD time. What does it? Camera time. Oh, it's calling it something else for some reason. Okay, so I'll just come in here and I'll find DPD camera time. There we go. And let me set this back to RGBA, right? So even though the DPD time image is in my DPD camera time pass, right? So that color information is in there, right? But now when I switch to RGBA, you'll see it's in here too because I'm plugging that pass into my red, green, and blue channels, right? So let's go back to just the beauty pass, right? And let's just plug those back together. Okay. Sometimes what you might want to do is you might want to feed several channels into, or one channel into several color channels. Like for instance, for the Z depth pass or the alpha pass, right? So if I want to look at my alpha channel, right? I can plug it into the red channel. Let's see, I should have an alpha channel. Maybe I don't. I might not have it exported with this one in alpha channel. So let me grab another image, another read node. Let's get passes 1, I think is another one I have. Okay, let's plug that one in here. Okay, and we'll set this to RGBA. And let's check this with alpha. Okay, there we go. So I can see the alpha information in here. So let's go back over to disconnect this, this right here, disconnect this one right here, and plug B back into passes 1. Okay, so I'm going to switch my viewport back to RGBA. Okay, I'm going to click on my shuffle node, double click on it to refocus it here, and you can see that I'm taking my alpha channel, and right now I'm just plugging it into my red channel. So you'll see it's just feeding directly into the red color channel. And I can plug into the green one. Now it's yellow, which is a mixture of red and green, and then I'll feed into blue, and now it's white. And I can also plug it into alpha. You'll see as I'm hovering over this, those values right here are changing, right? You see that alpha is still 0. Plug this into my alpha channel. Now you can see my alpha is 1. Okay. So let's go ahead and set this back to beauty. And we'll just replug it in. I can have several inputs into my shuffle node. So for instance, what I might have is I might have, like for instance, this file right here has my beauty pass, right? So if I come in here and I look at beauty, right? But I notice my alpha channel was empty, which is a bummer, right? I can come look at this file, and so I've noticed, hey, I had the alpha channel turned on for this file, so exported in a different file. Okay, so I want the beauty pass from one of these files, but I want the alpha from the other file. How do I combine them together? So on the shuffle node, what you can do is you can take this right here on the left-hand side. It will let you add another input to the list for the shuffle node. So it lets you combine more than one image together, right? So you'll see here, I still have this set up, right? So let's go ahead and set this to B's. Let's set this to RGBA again, right? To make sure I'm looking at the color information, right? So I'm taking my beauty pass from this file, and then I'm plugging it to the red, green, and blue, right? So I'm seeing it in the red, green, and blue information. And I want the alpha channel from A to be plugging into my output's alpha channel, because you can see here I don't have any alpha channel, right? And if I hover over, you see that alpha is 0, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, for this down here, I'm going to choose another input. But I'm going to choose it from the A, another channel, but I'm choosing it from the A input. So now I'm going to come over to alpha, and now I'm going to plug in that alpha channel into here. And now you can see here, now I have alpha on these pixels because it's feeding in that alpha information from this file. Okay. Okay, so that's the basics of mixing and adding together the color channels and remixing them to what you need them to do. Okay, so now let's look at how to combine our passes together. Okay, so in this setup over here, let's go ahead and bring this read node up here. Also notice down here, we didn't talk about this, but if you have a really big setup, you can always use this to kind of look around down in the bottom of the corner. But I have two, this is essentially the same exact setup, but just done in two different ways. Okay, so in this example here, I have my EXR file with all my render passes that I took from RenderMan, right, and exported, and so it's all packed together. And so all of these passes that I want to use are packed into this single file. Okay, and then what I'm doing is I'm piping them out into shuffle nodes so I can piping out the output. And so these shuffle nodes are going to isolate and use very specific passes. Okay, so you can see this shuffle node right here. Let's go ahead. I'm going to set this to like 2. And then I'm also going to clear it for now. So let's double click on this. So you can see here I'm taking, I have my environment light beauty pass. So it's the beauty pass of just the environment light. And again, I'm plugging to red, green, and blue. This one right here, I have the key light. Double click on this so I can see the settings. So you see here, the key light, red, green, and blue. Right? This one right here, the rim light, red, green, and blue. And then this one's like my emission information, red, green, blue. So you'll see I'm taking each of these and getting color information or a color image, and essentially I'm pulling them out and separating them out from this file, this EXR file. Okay, and I also have these color corrects set up, and this is just kind of to show you guys something in a second. Okay, but for now, let me go ahead and actually, I'm just going to delete these. Which is handy because you can see here that as I'm deleting them, it's preserving the chain or the essentially the path from our start point to our end point, which is this node right here. So in order to add our files together, let me go ahead and just get rid of these. Before I go any further, let's talk about these little elbows. So if you hold a control on your keyboard, you'll see that you have these little diamonds show up on your pipes, right? And so this is actually just purely for organization and aesthetics. So if you, for instance, if I get rid of these, let's just get rid of all these. If I have a bunch of nodes and they're all kind of like crossing across each other and, I'm feeding things around, sometimes this gets really messy and kind of hard to look at. So if you have that like organizational streak in you, what you can do is you can hold control, left click and drag, and you get these little elbows that'll essentially give you a little corner to your pipes, right? What's cool about this too is you could also, for instance, instead of having 4 different unique arrows coming out of this pass and going to the shuffle nodes, what I could do is I could pull this up and all of these guys, let's disconnect them for a second, I could actually attach this node point, right? So instead of having all those nodes radiating out directly from the middle of this guy, I can try to organize it this way, where I have a single juncture point coming out, right? So for the most part, this is just purely aesthetic. It's just for helping you organize and clean up your file. And so I'm just using it in my case to kind of just help me see the structure of this a little bit better. Okay. So in order to add my passes, especially my light passes, so if I separated all my lights into different render groups and light groups, that means I have these light group passes, right? But I want to combine them back together to get my actual beauty pass, right? To get something that looks like this, right? So in order to do that, I'm going to use what's called a merge node. If you are familiar with any other compositing program like After Effects or Photoshop, which do compositing, a merge node is just like a lot of the blending modes in those Adobe programs. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to press M, type in merge. Okay, and so the merge node is going to composite, which means it's going to combine more than one image together. Okay, so I have this, it wants more than one image, and I can combine a bunch of them. So in this case, I have an A and a B. So this order is pretty important because what you can think of it in this way. If you read this blending mode or this operation right here, you can read it like A over B, right? So it's the A image is going to be on top of or over the B image. Okay. So let's take a look at that actually over here. So I'm going to take this guy. Let's go ahead and take these guys. I'm going to copy them and paste them over here. Because what I have here is I have a beauty pass and I have a background composite image. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a merge node. Okay. And I want my background or the bottom image to be B, which is this background image. And I want the top image to be A. So this is going to be on top. So if I take a look at this, you'll see that my image is placed on top of the background image. If I shuffle these back the other way, you'll see it's going to be doing something a little funky. Let me go ahead and see if I just, I'm not sure if I can easily fix that problem. But essentially what's happening is because this image right here doesn't have any alpha right here, that means it has transparency. So it means it's 0. So what's happening here is this image right here is laying on top of my 3D objects, but because it has transparencies to it, you can see through the image to the other one, right? If I had like a solid image, or let's see, rectangle. Let's do a rectangle, right? And if I put that as my A image, you can see because this rectangle has full alpha on it, 1 alpha, when it's placed in the A slot, it's going to overwrite completely the bottom image, or B, right? If I mix those the other way, right, you can see my objects are on top of the rectangle then. Okay. All right, so that order is really important because it changes what's being operated on top of what. Okay. So let's go ahead and set it like this. So we have our operations up here. And we also have what channels we're looking at right here. So by default, if you're shuffling out your channels, you're kind of trying to make everything just be the red, green, and blue channel for that object. So you can see here, when I shuffled right here, I'm taking my beauty pass and I'm making it output as red, green, and blue, right? What I can also do is I can change this to a different channel. So for instance, for my A, I can choose the beauty environment light. So you can see it's pulling the, and let's set a different alpha channel, so I can just choose my alpha channel here. There we go. So you can see here's just my environment, beauty environment pass. I can change it to my key light, right? And again, because these passes don't necessarily have alpha in them, I have to choose an alpha channel, right? So I'm just going to go to my alpha channel, right? And so all it's doing is it's coming through this chain right here. And it's just determining through this chain, it's coming in with all these render passes packed into it, and I'm just choosing which pass I want to be composited into this image, right? And so, we have our all these color channels, and I can turn them off in our alpha channel. So if there's anything I don't want, I can just turn it off, and you'll notice, you know, when you have something that looks transparent and you're like, what the heck is going on? Just double check on here, and you can see here, by default, when I switch to certain passes, so let's say I do my albedo pass, because it doesn't have an alpha color channel associated with that pass, then I have to come here and hand assign an alpha channel. So I'll choose that red, green, and blue alpha channel. Okay. So I can do the same thing with my B, and then I can set my outputs, but most likely you're going to just keep it like this. Here's where if you plug in a mask, we will see that mask. So let's go ahead and grab that mask image, which we have over here. I'll plug it in right here. Okay, so we have this mask right here. Okay, and if I use the mask on this node, right, you'll see once I plugged it in, you can see it's taking the alpha channel of whatever's plugged into the mask area. So the mask input. So you can see it's taking my alpha attribute, right? So it's taking that alpha attribute, and actually I don't have anything plugged into it. There we go. So it's taking the alpha attribute and it's making that the mask. So if I come back over here, you can see now it's doing that merge, but it's only merging the head from that input pass and then adding it on top of image B. Okay. So this on this node right here, you can see that mask right there. Mix is going to be essentially your opacity for the operation. So it could be, a lot of nodes are going to have this. So if you want to tone back the effect of it, you can just use this mix and bring it back. And so since we're adding two images together, this is essentially just changing the opacity of that first image, right? If I was using, let's just take a look. I'm going to press C to add a color correct node, and I'm going to take a look at this. So I just want to do a color correct node. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to brighten it up, right? Those settings are on, in this case, on a different tab. So sometimes you have to hunt it down. So I can come over here, and you can see over here I have mask, right? So if I plugged in a mask, this is where my mask would be. And here's my mix, right? So I can tone back the effect without having to actually tweak all the settings. Okay? Let me get rid of that. Okay, so let's come back over to this area right here. Okay, so we want to combine or add together these images, right? So what we're going to be doing is, because these are light information on top of nothingness or black, the operation we're going to be doing is either an over or a plus, because we're just adding these images together, and it's eventually going to give us our beauty image that looks like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a merge node. So I'm going to take a look at this merge node, and I'm just going to add these guys together. Okay. So see, as I'm adding these together, or adding new each of these render passes to it, you'll see it's like I'm turning on the lights in my scene, right? If each of those images, each of these shuffle nodes had, let's say, the alpha, so if I'm just going to take the alpha and plug that into the alpha, this, I'm not sure if it's going to work in this case, but this might not actually technically work right, because my over operation, I might not even have, I think this passes 2 doesn't even have an alpha channel, so let's see if I can grab passes 1 and plug that in instead. Let me get rid of that. So I'll just plug this into there. Okay, and so I'm just going to get rid of that. And let's disconnect these guys. Okay, so now what's happening here is this one actually does have an alpha channel to it, so I'm attaching that alpha to it. And so as I'm doing an over, you can see this A is sitting right on top of B. So in this case, because I have alpha, I can't just do this over operation, which is just going to, you know, layer them on top of each other, because this one is going to be blocking out the bottom one because of the alpha channel. The reason why the passes 2 image was working okay is it's kind of like think of like a transparency that people would use on a projector. It's as if parts of the transparency are colored in, and parts of it that fade to black have no marker on it. So if you held it up to the light, you can see through the parts that had no marker. And so if you did an over and you stack those on top of each other, obviously those parts that have no marker on them are going to be transparent. You can see through them to the bottom layer, right? In this case, those areas that are black on my objects are actually black because I have that alpha channel coming in that's blocking out my transparency in that area, right? Apologize if that sounds really confusing, but just understand that this blending mode might change depending on what is coming into it, right? So I'm going to come over to my merge node, and I'm going to change it to a different operation. So let's do plus, right? So what that's going to do is just going to add the pixels together, right? So because black is 0, it's like adding 0 to anything else. It's just going to be the original number. It's not going to be 0. It's not going to change to 0, right? I could choose, let's see if something else, like let's try multiply. So multiply is going to multiply the pixel values together, right? So if one of those images has 0 or black inside the image, it's going to multiply the other pixel in the other image by black, which is 0, so it's going to drop it down to 0. So if you're ever interested in any of these blending modes or understanding what's going on in them, like overlay or minus or screen, right, or plus, it's just looking up these blending modes. They're very common blending modes on YouTube, or on not YouTube. Well, there's YouTube videos on it, but on Google, you can get a good sense of what they're supposed to do. And you can even hover over here and it tells you the actual operation. But if you're trying to understand how those relate in terms of pixels and visuals, there's plenty great visual resources online of what the different blending modes look like. Okay, so it's very helpful to understand kind of what these actual blending modes or operations are kind of doing, because then you'll have a more predictable result and you won't get frustrated by how these images are being added or interacting with each other. So you won't be like, I don't understand why these images look different than what RenderMan has. So yeah, I doubt you guys talk like that. Okay, so in this case, because I have this alpha, I had to switch it to a plus operation, which is going to just add the images together. Right? And I'm just going to keep adding my layers together. And now here we go. We have a single file, right? A single EXR file that has all my render images packed out. I'm feeding that file into all these shuffle nodes. Each of these shuffle nodes is pulling out very specific render passes out of that file, right? And now I'm merging them back together into a beauty pass image, right? So why do we want to do this? Why not just pull out the beauty pass image? It's because, again, I have the ability to essentially isolate and select very particular passes, right? So I can come in here and I can adjust just the environment light pass, right? Or I can come over to the rim light pass, right? And I can change, turn it on and off. I can change its color, right? I might go to the saturation wheel and change its color and make it look like it's a different color, something like that, right? So I have all that extra control. Okay, so let's take a look at, let me go ahead and get back to that. Oop. And then let's make this just a little prettier for my sake. Okay, so this is one way of doing it. The other way you could do it is you can just do this in kind of like a chain method, right? So this can be a little bit more cluttered, right? You have a lot more visual space you're taking up, and you kind of have to organize and make it neater. You have to use more nodes, right? Because I'm shuffling it out. This method over here, I'm actually doing kind of like a chain method, right? So they're just feeding into each other. And so the way this is working is you'll actually see I'm actually merging the same input over itself multiple times. What I'm doing is I'm essentially feeding it into both the A and the B. So you can see this read node is coming into both A and B. So let me go ahead and get rid of some of this stuff first. A and B, right? And in the A and B channel, I'm just changing what specific render pass I'm using. So for instance, let's take a look at these. I'll just start this from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and add a merge node. Just press M on my keyboard, which is a hotkey for merge. So I'll plug this into B, and I'll also plug it into A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add two different render passes from the same input together. Okay, so in the A channel, I want to grab the environment light, and then in the B channel, I want to grab the key light. Okay, so you'll see here, I'm just doing an over node, or you can also do a plus node. And so it's just doing the same thing we did over here with the merge node from two different shuffles, right? And if I want to add another image, I'm just going to go ahead and do merge, another merge, and I'll plug it into this one. Okay. And down here, what I'm going to do is, because the output of this merge node is now RGBA, right? So if I look at shuffle, right? Let's take a look at this shuffle node, right? You'll see that RGBA is now just those two render passes combined together, right? Because these nodes that are exporting, unless you specify a specific channel you want to plug it into, it's just going to write it out as a color image or RGBA. So for this first one, I want one of these channels to be the RGBA because it's going to be the information from this channel. Let's get rid of that. Let's come down here. And we want this to be another one of our render passes because we're adding another render pass to whatever's coming out of this. Right? So we have this, and we want to add that. So right now it's just adding two copies of this image onto each other. So that's why it looks like a lightened version of itself. So I'll come in here and I'm just going to choose rim light. Okay. So you can see here we're combining the environment light and key light. So double click on this environment light, key light. And on this one right here, we're taking that RGBA from the previous merge node, and we're adding the rim light to it. Okay. And then let's go ahead and add one more merge node. So merge, and I'm just going to again feed them in both inputs into the previous merge node. And I'm going to come over and on this one, I'm going to, for the B channel, I'm going to do my emission. So I'm going to do only emit. Okay, and let's take a look at it. There you go. So that's my beauty pass combined together in a different way. For some reason, I think I grabbed the wrong pass on these ones. Oh, this is pass 1. Let's do passes 2. Just change that to 2. And then I'll have to make sure that these guys aren't pulling alpha. Actually, it doesn't really matter. In this case, since I'm doing plus. Okay, so these images should look exactly the same, right? Just two different methods of putting them together. Okay, so let's take a look at how we might manipulate these now. So if I want to, one of the basic ways to change or isolate any of these channels or make manipulations to them or tweaks to them is to use color correction nodes. And then also using masks to isolate what's being color corrected. Okay, I'm going to pull this image over here. So I'm going to use, let's take a look at the color selection. So over here we can right click and, right click and say color, and we have all these different color options in here, right? Or we can come over here, click color. Again, we have all our nodes. Or we can, if we know what color nodes we want, we can just type in with tab. Okay, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose color. The most common ones, and you can see the most common or popular ones are going to have a hotkey associated with them. So color correct and grade node. Okay, so the grade node, what that's going to do is it's going to essentially let us change the overall value distribution for that pass, right? I'm going to do it up here because I think visually it's going to make more sense and be easier to look at. Really nice functionality of Nuke. You can just click and drag and drop over, and it'll figure out the input and output for you. So let's take a look back at this guy. And actually, let's take a look at this node specifically. Okay. So I have my environment beauty pass, and we have several value and color settings here. Okay. By default, we can just click and drag any of these settings to change them, right? So I can go ahead and pull the gain up, right, which is just going to be an overall brightness. So gain's probably the most common one I'm going to be using is gain. On the grade node, we also have black and white point. So what this is going to do is it's going to change essentially the maximum minimum values in your image. So right now it's saying black is 0, or 0 goes to black and 1 goes to white, right, which is just our normal value distribution. If I bring black higher, what it's going to do is it's going to associate with different values and crush them or push them into the black color. Right? So this is essentially defining what value or pixel value should be black. So you see as I bring this up, darker values are now being crushed to black, right? Because now anything that is 0.23 or lower is now black. Okay? White's the same way, right? If I bring this lower, those values that are at this pixel value or higher, or this number or higher, are going to be pushed to white, right? So as I bring this lower, more and more things are being pushed to white, okay? Similarly, I can go ahead and push them in the opposite direction, right? So white is getting further away, right? So if something was really close to white before, now it's further away because white is now defined as 3.8. So if I had something that was a value of 1, right, then that would have been white by default, but now 1 is no longer white. 3.8 is, so now it's a darker value. I can do the same thing with black, right? So this is actually pretty handy for doing contrast, right? So if you want to increase contrast, you can bring the black point up a little bit and the white point down a little bit, right? And so you'll see if, I'm going to press D to disable this. You can see I'm increasing the contrast, right? which is kind of just adding a more dramatic value shift, which actually kind of looks nice right up here. Doesn't look as good on her face. So some areas you might actually want to do that because you can see that those muscles are actually looking better and that the metal right there is actually looking better. So when I turn it off, it actually looks kind of gross and bland. So, I'll probably want to mask that in a second, but we'll take a look at it in a second. So come down here. Lift, gain, and multiply are going to be, and gamma are all kind of different ways of changing the value distribution, right? So they just do it in slightly different ways. So you'll see with like lift, it's just going to lift everything the same way. Gain is going to brighten and darken everything, but within essentially a value range. So, white stay white, black stay black, and then everything in between is kind of being adjusted. Multiply is kind of similar to gain. Offset is going to be similar to lift, where it's just going to offset all the values by adding to them. And then gamma is kind of, again, a different version of gain. So some of these things you might care about, some of you might not. If you're like a color grader or like a compositor that's doing final color look on the project, you probably have a better sense of when you want to use one of these. But most of the time, you guys probably just want to play with the black point, white point, and gain. Okay. In these settings, we're just using sliders. You can do different things. Like if you click on this number here, you can actually input the specific number and then the specific channel, right? So if I want like the green channel to be brighter, I can come in here and then let's just type in 2, right? And so you'll see the green color is boosted, right? Set that back to 1. Okay. One thing I didn't talk about yet is you can click your mouse cursor inside one of these channels, anything where you can put a number in. You can middle mouse click and drag inside of it. So you can see you can actually dynamically change it and slide it in here if it's a number area, right? And I'm going to right click and I'm going to set revert knobs. So if you ever need to reset all the things, you can just right click and say set all knobs to default or reset knobs or revert knobs. Okay. We also have a color wheel, right? So it's just kind of like the 4-number one that we were looking at earlier, right? But this way it also has sliders for each one and also has a essentially like a value slider and then like shifting to warm and cool and in the green and magenta areas, so opposites in those areas. Okay. We also have an alpha, right? So we can actually change the alpha's values as well, which probably you won't want to do as much, right? And then this right here is going to be a color picker. So if I use the color picker tool, which remember is the control button, right? Or control or command, if you left click on something, you'll see it's actually setting the color or the values for us based on something that we're clicking in our scene by holding control and left clicking. Okay, I'm going to hold alt and left or control and right click to get rid of that, and we'll click off that to stop it from sampling whatever the color picker is. And we can just go back to let's see, let's turn off the 4s and let's just set this back to 1. Okay, so that's the basic of using this. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. It also has this node over here that's very similar. Oh, actually, no, the grade node has enough space that the mix, which is essentially the opacity, right, is on this page, and so is the mask information if we plug in a mask. So let's go ahead and, while we're at it, let's go ahead and plug in our mask. So I think I have mine here. I'm just going to paste it up here. And click on that mask, shuffle it up here. Take a look at this mask. So we want to plug this into alpha channel, and then we come back over here and you'll see that gain node is only affecting whatever I have as that object. The reason why I wasn't showing at first was because I did not have anything in the alpha channel, and the grade node wants the alpha channel right now. I could go in just what I did right there where I just defined the alpha channel, or I can come in here and I can just choose a different color channel to be my mask. Okay. All right, so that's one way. So let's go ahead and show the color correct node. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this node. So the color correct node is going to be very similar to, so that's, let's go ahead and right click. Right click, you can see color correct. Okay. So let me just check the recording, make sure it's going. Okay. So the color correct node is going to be a lot like the grade node, but with some settings there's more of them, in some areas settings there's less of them, right? So the color correct node is going to have a master control, which is very similar to what we did with the grade control or grade, but also has those settings for different value regions, right? So I can come in here and I can change the gain of my entire image, or I can change the gain of just my shadows, right? Or I can change the gain of just my highlights, right? And I don't have a lot of highlights in here, but you can kind of see them there, right? Let's take a look at, I'm actually going to do this with the, because this is such a dark image, I want to do this on the beauty merge together node, right? Let's get rid of this color correct for a second. So I'm going to come over here, and so we can bring the gain of the whole image up, gain of just the highlights, right? So we can control the highlights. It also has different settings, so we can change saturation, right? So we can desaturate it or extra saturate it. We can change the contrast. So we were doing that with a black and white point, but this is kind of a simplified setting to moving those black and white points further and closer apart to change the contrast, right? And then we also have gamma, gain, and offset, which are the same as the other ones. So what's cool is with this is we can come in and I can do like the midtones. Let's do like a little bit of, I'm going to kind of boost them a little bit higher, boost the contrast a little bit. I have really blown out areas right there, so I want to go to the highlights. I'll bring the gain down just a little bit, right? So they're not quite as blown out. And let's go ahead, I might add some saturation to the shadows, right? But I don't want to do it in the red channel because that red's really getting cranked up, so I'm going to go ahead and push the other color channels. Okay, so I'm getting more in those areas that aren't red. So let's go ahead and just, I'm going to press D to see what the difference looks like, right? It's not great. I'm kind of crunching everything a little too high contrast, so I might come back over to, let's take a look at this midpoint, and I'm going to pull the contrast back a little bit. I don't think it really needed that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is the color correct node has a really cool feature over here. So this is your value range, right? And so this is what you can see here how it's defining what values are affected by the highlights, what values are affected by the midtones, right? What values are affected by the shadow settings, right? So I can actually come in here and select and move the shadow and the midtone values to change what is defined as shadow and midtone, right? Let's go back into the color correct settings. I'm going to I have that saturation setting on the shadows super high, so I'm going to go ahead and reset that back to low or lower setting. And so let's go ahead and play with these settings. So you can see those color adjustments I was doing are now being applied to different areas because of what's now being defined as either shadow, midtone, or highlight. Okay, so the color correct node's super powerful. So let's go ahead and undo that for a second. Let's take a look at this one. All right, let's go ahead and pull this setting back to 1, and let's go ahead and do the mask. So I'm just going to reattach the mask. I'm just going to get this all set up. Okay, and then let's do the gain. Okay, and we got to make sure we have the correct channel. So right now I don't have alpha. I just the blue. So if I look at this, I don't have anything in the alpha channel coming out. So I just changed my masks to the blue channel. Okay, so that's one way to setting it up. And here's the other way that we looked at of how we're setting it up. So in order to color correct these, you'll see because I didn't shuffle them out, it's kind of hard to isolate and color correct them, right? If I added a color correct node here, let's take a look at this. If I add a color correct node after this guy, right? What's going to happen is it's going to color correct both of those channels that I'm merging together at the same time, right? Which is kind of frustrating, right? So it's not isolating those two color channels. So what I can do is pull these back together. I can actually add a color correct node right here. And what I'm going to do here is for these color correct nodes, we've been doing this in the red, green, and blue channel. We can do this in, so let's go back to the bottom of this, right, which is the composite of all three of these together. So before even any of my channels get down to these merge nodes to be combined together, I can actually tweak them before they get down there, right? So in here, this color correct node, I can select my key light, and now these color corrections are going to apply to that key light color node. If I look at this, you'll see I can't look at this again because remember, this viewport viewer is default looking at the RGBA passes, and this color correct node isn't actually outputting necessarily RGBA. It's just passing on all of my channels into the next node, right? And so the RGBA hasn't been changed to anything else. It's still this black pass that I had set up in RenderMan, or because of RenderMan packing everything together. So we might not be able to see it. I could always, switch over to Beauty Key, right, to take a look at this, and then I can see what's happening to that channel, right? But just keep that in mind. So I'm going to set it back to RGBA. I'm just going to go back down to my bottom node. You can see here, you see that let's do it in the gain node. Actually, it looks better. You see I can affect that single render pass because I changed this color correct node to be affecting the beauty key pass, right? So I can just go ahead and add another node, and this one's going to be the environment light. Let's pull these down. And I'm going to add another one, and this one's going to be the rim light. So beauty rim. Okay. So it's like that rim light. Thankfully, it gives us that little name right there. Another thing you can do is you can come over here and you can label some of these things like, hey. So you can see you can add, if you have to like specify something and the names aren't helpful, you can always change that with the label node. And most nodes have that. So, right, so the rim light, I can play around with that, play around with the environment light, right? And I can just kind of tweak them all, right? And same thing where I could set up my mask by coming down here. Let's pull that over to the side. I'm making a lot of duplicates I probably don't even need because I'm just keep duplicating things. And again, I can just mask out very specific ones of these guys. So let's take that key light, let's crank it up, and I only want it to be on the character. And so right now this mask node is going there, and I want to plug this into the alpha channel. So if I come down to here, you can see the key lights on this color correct node is being masked out for that statue. Okay, it's not affecting any of the other objects, it's just affecting the statue. Okay. All right, so I can do that with any of these objects if I want to make something specifically, isolated. Then I can do it that way. So two different ways of setting up these chains and combining our images together. They have their uses, right? Some of them are easier to understand and look at than others. So it's kind of up to you, whatever you like to do. Okay, let's take a look over here at some basic compositing. Okay, let's disable some of these guys. So what I have here is I have a beauty pass. Let's move this over. And I have a background image. Okay, and all I'm doing here simply is I am using a merge node to put my objects over my matte painting or my background image, right? Super simple stuff, right? What we can do further is we want to make this look better, right? We're going to do some color corrections to it, right? So we might add a color correct node to both my beauty pass and my background image, right? Let's pull this up. And I can come over here and let's say I want to make it darker, right? Because this background image is darker. So I'm going to bring the gain down. Maybe keep the highlights a little brighter. Not midtones, highlights. Pull the highlights up a little bit. The gain in the midtones a little bit. And let's just bring the gamma in the shadows darker, a little darker. And I might play with that range to make it so shadows is technically some lower. Okay, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert compositor, so this is not going to look amazing, but we kind of get the gist of it, right? So I'm just like, maybe I need to color correct that, and I need to color correct the back one. Maybe I'll use the individual color channels to tweak the colors, and maybe because this background image is more orange, maybe I want to come in here and play with the colors in this way. So I want to make it a little bit tinted orange, a little bit more, maybe tinted a little less in the green, a little more in the blue, a little less in the blue. There we go. Yeah. Right. So something like that. Again, I'm an expert here. What we're going to do now is some other things that we can help to, or some extra nodes that we might add for certain things, right? So far we've been looking, I'm going to keep these guys disabled, don't worry about them right now. So right now we're just adding a merge together, right? What we might want to do is we've been looking at using mask images. So my matte ID image, right? So we have our matte ID, which has those objects that have been defined as single color, right? So all we're doing is we're isolating one of those colors and making that the mask, right? So yeah, so there's that. I don't know why that one is that out. That green channel should be now the red channel. What? That's really strange. I don't know why that's showing blue. Oh, it's probably because of buffering thing. If your image or if your viewport ever gets like weird where it seems like it's not updating right, you come over here and just clear buffers, and that'll fix the image. Nuke will just like start packing in a bunch of things to start, like, or it's like building things into the memory, and then you need to clear it out and it's not properly doing it. Okay, coming back over here. So we had our mat.id images. That's how we were separating out before. We talked about cryptomat in a previous video, which we'll get back to in a second. This right here is our roto node. So a roto node is going to be, let's take a look actually over here. I keep going over here, and really I just want to focus back over on these guys. That's clear. Okay, let's go back to this. I want to set this back to our previous mask. Okay, here we go. And we'll go back to this. Okay. So I have all these color correct nodes that I've been doing. Just focus on this one for now. Okay. So we'll just use that for that gain. Okay. Actually, let's disable this one. We'll use this one right here. And so this one, I'll just push that gain up. All right. So let's say I want to add a mask, whether it's a specific shape or if it's just drawing out like a very feathered gradual gradient to try to like stop something from being affected by something else. So let's say, actually, let me go ahead and pull this down. I want to push the contrast up. So you're going to say I'm just pushing the whole contrast of my image up, right? So we could use, our what's it called? Our shuffle node to try to isolate and select our mat.id image. What I want to do is a roto node. So this is a method you can use to create masks inside of Nuke. Okay, so I'm going to press tab and type in roto, draw. Okay, so the roto node is going to have a bunch of settings, and this is going to be the list of your hand-drawn shapes. If you've ever used After Effects before, you might be familiar with this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is by default, it's going to have a spline creation tool. Okay, a Bezier spline creation tool. You'll see as I click on this, it's going to start drawing out a path, right? And then when I complete the image, let's just focus on the roto. So I complete it. So when I draw this, it's creating these curve points, right? And then so what it's going to do is it's going to keep creating these curve points and create my custom shape until I either press enter or click on the original point. Then it completes it, right? And so what's going to happen is now this is now isolating whatever's inside here as the alpha. So let's go ahead and take a look at the alpha channel. Okay, so you can see whatever's inside this shape is now 1, and everything outside is transparent, right? We can go in here and we can invert, right? So we can click on this button right here to invert it. So that's going to reverse the mask. We can also change the opacity of it, right? Whether it's a full mask or a partial mask. This right here is really handy. This is called feathering. So this is essentially like going to give a feather or a fade to the edges. So if I click on feather, you can see that's going out there. Or it can go in the inside as well. We can choose the fall off. So that's going to be the rate of change for the feathering, right? So if I come back over to let's go ahead and attach this as my mask, right? And let's go back to looking at RGB of this over here. You can see here that color correct node, and let's do something more drastic so you can see. You can see where it's affecting that image. We have that really gentle mask affecting it. Okay. Some cool hotkeys with the roto is if I press Z, what it's going to do is it's going to kind of clean up all of my curves, right? So my curves have little curve handles to them, so it lets me like adjust the shape very specifically, right? But sometimes it can, you saw as before, it gets kind of like wonky and all over the place. So you can always press Z, click off, press Z to, or select all of them and press Z, and it's going to fix those handles for you. Okay. So So yeah, so we can come over here. Lets me manipulate my shape after I've drawn it. So select all is going to either select the splines or the points, right? This right here is a custom handle for feathering. So by default, let's go ahead and go back to the feather and set the feather to 0 and set the feather fall off to just 1. Right, so that should give me a hard edge. If I close the roto, you can see that hard edge right around it. What we can do here is actually, let's take a look at this because I think it's easier to look at it this way. Right, so when we change the feather, that would change the fall off on the that gradient on the entire border. What we can do is if we select one of our vertices or curve points, we can actually extend out custom feather points. Right. So for that point, we can actually have a fall off specifically just for that part of our image, right? So we can turn that up, and you can see there, this part of our mask has that, but the other parts don't. Okay. So that little handle that's on each of these curve points that pops up right there is that custom feather feature for that option. Okay. We can select our splines, which in this case I don't think we have any. Select points, select feather points, right? So we can just specify selecting just those guys, but we're not going to worry about that. Okay, I'm going to delete this mask. Okay, and I'm going to go back into this shape drawing tool right here. So that was Bezier. Cusp Bezier is going to be like the Bezier tool, but they're going to be linear points. So we're not going to have curves. So this is really handy if you need to block out a really linear shape like a door or a panel or something like that. Right? So these points are just going to be rigid and hard and not have a curvature to them. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy. Let's select the B-spline. Right? So the B-spline is going to be kind of like the default Bezier, but the curvature is not going to pull between these points. It's going to be essentially approximated or interpolated between the points. Okay? Just a different kind of look. It's going to give a more clean, smooth transition look. Okay. We also have very specific shapes, right? So we can just draw out an ellipse. You can hold Shift to lock the proportions to it, right? So it's square, right? I also have a rectangle, right? Super simple, super easy. Okay. And let's go ahead and do. We have cusp rectangle, which is just going to force the corner points to not curve if they ever do. And then open spline is not going to require a completion of the shape, right? You actually have this shape right here. I'm going to click on the selection tool to finish creating it. And you can see here, each of these guys actually, it has like a shape it can expand into, right? So this is really handy if you have very specific small areas or lines that you want to draw out and make like a custom curve for that. So one side is going to be the size of the mask at that point, and the other side is going to be the fall off or the feather for that area as well, right? Okay. So those are those different types. We can just click and drag and select and delete. We can add more shapes or more masks. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to switch to ellipse. Drag one there, and then those are folders. Let's click off of my shape, and I'll just click this tool again, drag another one, and you'll see now I have multiple shapes. Okay. This is a good time to talk about animation. So you'll see over here, this is actually these shapes. You can see right there that it set a keyframe, or it should have set a keyframe. You can get rid of that keyframe. Let's go ahead and I'm going to right-click and say Set Key on All Knobs. Okay. So now I have a keyframe on its position, or I should. This part I am less familiar with. So let's see, let's pause it while I refresh my. Okay, so in this area, normally what you can do is you right-click on really any attribute, just like in Maya, and just right-click and say Set Key, right? But on this case right here, they actually have these buttons here. So this right here is Set Key at Current Frame or Remove the Current Keyframe, right? This color blue is going to tell you where, if you have a keyframe on that frame. So if it's dark blue, that means you have a keyframe. I can use these to jump between keyframes, and I can just right-click on this one right here to remove that keyframe. So you have two different ways to do keyframes, right? So I can go to a frame, like let's say I want to start here. Actually, I'll do this on this other one because I already set one up. So I'll select this guy right here. Oops, this ellipse right here. Get rid of that keyframe. Actually, let's set a keyframe. Let's go to frame 0. I'll set a keyframe. Okay, and I'll go to another frame, and then I'll just transform that ellipse. Okay, let's just go to select all, and I'm just going to move him. Okay, so by default, you'll see it highlighted blue, and it went ahead and made a keyframe for me. So I can do it that way. I can change the shape, right? I can change the to something like that, and you'll see it's going to change shape between that, right? Which is super handy if you have an object that's moving and changing form between frames, right? Another way you can do it is you can do the transform tab, right? So in the transform tab, we can actually do holistic changes to the shape or the whole entire mask, whether it's translating it or rotating it or scaling it without actually having to manipulate the points, right? It's also going to have a nice curvature to it that we can mess around with, but let's not worry about that for right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just delete all these keyframes for the moment. So let's go back to my shape, okay, and let's delete the keyframes for this one. Okay. All right, I have just this one shape now. The other one got deleted. So let's go to the previous one, delete the keyframe, previous one, delete the, or next one, delete the keyframe. Okay, so I just got this single shape. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep this simple and do the transform node. Okay, so what I'm going to do is at this frame, I'm going to right click and say set key. Okay, and I'm going to go to the frame that I want it to change to, and let's go ahead and move this to another space. And so you see here I have this keyframes being set, right? You see it's setting them automatically. Let's take a look at the translate values. Okay, so just like in Maya, we should be able to select these points and change how it's animating to that location over time, right? Let's say, let's see if I can do it with Alt or Shifts. There we go. Okay. Okay. And so now you can see if, let's say, I'm going to take let's take the translate X, let's pull it up like this, and translate Y, let's pull it down like this. Okay. So now you'll see it's going to kind of take an arc approach, right? So you can see it's curving from one location to the next. It's not going just literally in a straight line, right? So we can use those, and we can also change when it's happening, right? I can just grab in here and select these keyframes. Actually, let's do it in the dope sheet. You can select it in here, right? I'll select these keyframes, and I can just move them closer so it happens sooner or happens further away. Okay. I don't want to get super deep into keyframes and animation because I'm not as versed in it in Nuke for sure, but this is the basics of it. Okay, so that's the roto brush. We can add our roto tool. So we can add new masks to it. We can also have these masks add and subtract from each other, right? So we can come over here and I can say, change this mode from how they're combining together. So let's do minus, right? So you can see that I'm using the second mask to subtract from the other one, right? This mask, I can go ahead and select these points, and I can go ahead and feather them out, right? And if I click off and hide this, you'll see, right, how those are being combined together. So you can combine these together in any way and shape form you want. Okay, so that's the roto mask. The one that I also want to take a look at is how to use the crypto mat, right? So we looked at how to create crypto mat in the previous video and how to set them up in RenderMan. So, and I also talked about how to install and get the plugin in, right? So just following those instructions through the CryptoMat GitHub page is usually enough to just get the gizmo to show up. Okay, so it should show up here. If not, just let me know and we can talk about getting installed on your machine. Okay, so I'll add a CryptoMat node. And so CryptoMat node is specifically going to want that CryptoMat render pass. Okay, so I'm going to go and grab my CryptoMat render pass. I'm going to drop it in, right? It's not an image sequence right now, right? It's just a single image, so I'm going to go in here, make sure I have sequences selected, and then just select the CryptoMat, okay? And let's go to a frame where I actually have a CryptoMat image in this case. Okay. So now if I view my crypto mat, you can see, let's change this back to RGB, I have my all of my mat ID images. It's just like my normal mat ID. Set this one to red, green, blue. Right? So it's just like my normal mat ID pass, but it just, remember, does it for me, right? It gives every object a unique mat ID. Okay? So I'm going to come over to my mat ID pass. So the mat ID pass, what it's going to do is it's going to let you select different colors in here, and it's going to turn that into the alpha output or the mask output for your mask, right? So if I use this right here, I'm going to add to my selection. So let's say I want both of these balls to be in that mask selection. So what I can do is I can use my color picker, which again is holding Control or Command and left clicking on an object or a color in your scene to color pick that color, right? And so I can add whatever objects I want to that mask, right? I can use color picker remove, and again use command or Control left click to remove objects or remove colors, right? I can go over here and change where it's going to be outputting my mask information, what channel it's going to be putting into. Also can, let's go ahead and add, I can use the clear button to clear out this list of selections. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just select a few objects. And now let's go ahead and take a look at the alpha channel. You'll see, because this is feeding it to alpha channel, I can see both those objects I have selected in the alpha channel. And you can see I actually can left click and do the color picker with the mat ID, a crypto mat node selected, and you can see it's doing this for me. And I'll just want to make sure when I'm done selecting my mask, I want to make sure this is no longer color, that little color picker is no longer in there, so I don't accidentally at some point add more things to my masks. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and, so that's pretty much the basics of the CryptoMat. Once you get it installed, it's very, very easy to use, probably way easier to use than the mat ID pass, because you don't have to hand isolate objects and then isolate the colors by feeding them out to a single color channel, right? Because CryptoMat's just going to do that for you. What else? Okay, let's come back over to here. So what I did over here is, let's talk through it. So I'm going to take a look at this. So I have this color correct node. So this color correct node is just kind of adding, let's go disable this one as well, is adding a little bit of brightness and a little bit of contrast here, which makes more sense with all these other settings, which we'll take a look in a second. But what I'm doing here is I'm only wanting it to be in the center of my image, right? So if I go here, I only want it to be right there in that center of the image, just kind of add a little bit more focus right there. It makes more sense with once you have the glow and the blur and the light wrap on. Right, it makes more sense with all those guys, but right now let's not focus on that right there. So let's actually, I'm going to go ahead and disable this for now, pull this up, and I'm going to add a color correct node. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm actually going to bring all the borders darker. So this is just a natural way of vignetting, adding a vignette to your images, pulling the outside areas less focus on them, so that you draw more attention to the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color correct node. I'm going to, just by default, I'm going to bring everything down a little bit. I'm going to bring the contrast down a little bit. Again, bring the image a little darker. You can push it a little bit further. It doesn't hurt to push it further because we can always pull it back. Let's pull this out a little bit. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a roto node. So let's go to roto node. Okay. Let's clear everything else. I'm just going to double click on the roto node. Okay, so in this roto node, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out a rectangle. So let's go ahead and draw out a rectangle. Okay, and I'm going to feed this rectangle into my color correct. Okay, so by default, right, it's going the wrong direction. So I'm going to go ahead and invert it. And I want to feather it as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and let's see if I can hide the extras. 1 second. Let me pause this. Okay, I'm back. All right, so there's a hotkey. So if you want to show off or hide some of those like settings that show up, like cancel. So for instance, if you use a transform node, that'll have its own little doodads inside of here. These are called overlays or viewport overlays. So if you want to manipulate this overlay or see what this is doing without having to see this red line, right? So I want to tweak these settings, but whenever I have this in the properties panel, right? that overlay is going to show up. So I can press the Q on my keyboard to hide my overlays. Okay, so I'm going to come in here, come back to my roto, and I'm going to go ahead and increase the feather. Let's do the inverse feather, and we'll change the fall off. Let's go ahead and pull it out. So what I might do is now I might actually scale up my roto. Okay. And so this is a little intense, so I'm probably going to go to the roto transform. Actually, no, the roto, and I'm going to change the opacity of it. So I'll just bring it back a little bit. Right? So now I just have like a nice vignette to kind of help there. Still a little strong, you can really see that vignette, but something like that's going to really help kind of pull attention away from the edges and into the center of your image. You can do the same process or use the same premise for really any type of vignetting you want to do. You don't have to literally just darken the image. I can make the, let's see, I'm going to do color correct. I can make the center of the image like a little bit brighter. So I might do a little bit of gain. So just boost it a little bit. And then I might also maybe crank the contrast just slightly. Right? And then what I might do is, let's go ahead and add another roto for this one. Roto. Okay. Drag that mask over to the roto. Right now the roto doesn't have any images in it, so it's not working. So let's go ahead and clear out everything else. Come back to this roto, and I'm going to go ahead and draw a sphere in this case, or ellipse. So I'll draw an ellipse. Oops. Let's turn on the overlays. There we go. Okay, I'm just going to drag these over to like the center of my image where I want the focal point to be. Let's go ahead and press Q to turn off that. You can see that it's kind of hard to tell, but there's this hard line, so I'm just going to use that feather and just crank the feather up. So you can see here I'm essentially vignetting, but I'm using it to increase the focal point in the middle. And then this one's decreasing the focus and attention from the edges of the frame, right? Okay, so that's some basic kind of settings. What I also have here is I have a glow node. So let's take a look at the glow node. It looks kind of gross right now, but let's take a look at this. And I might actually add this closer to the bottom, right? So we'll just do glow. It's a pretty common node. It's just going to essentially take your highlights and essentially blur them and then brighten them. So what we want to do is we want to change what's being affected. So pretty much everything in my image is being affected. So I'm going to increase the tolerance, which is essentially choosing which values are being accepted into this glow node. We'll bring the brightness down so it's not as noticeable. You want it to be really subtle. And it's kind of oversaturating things, so I'm going to bring the saturation down. Okay? So maybe we'll bring this a little brighter and bring the saturation down a little bit. Okay. Right. And I can go ahead and I had a mask set for it, so I'm just going to use that mask right here. And so that was just kind of try to keep the things on the outside from getting blown out too much. Let's get rid of these guys. Just clean this all up. Right. So I can come over here, I can press D on my roto to see the effect that that roto is having. So you can see it's still blooming right here, glowing right here, but I'm trying to pull it away from the outside. And again, I can come back to this mask and I can change the opacity and bring it down a little bit. So bring it down to 0, which actually I would want to do it the opposite way. So what I would probably want to do is I'd want to invert it. No, okay, I'm getting confused by it. Probably just feather it and just increase the feather by a lot, so like maybe 200. So it's like a more gradual fall off from the center of the image. It's probably varies. There we go, something like that. So it's a little too intense. You can see it on those the ribs. It's a little too much, so I'm going to just bring it down a little bit. Increase the tolerance. Okay. All right, we can blur out the background, so I'm just using a blur node, right, between the black background and the merge. So I'll click on that, so it just blurs out our background. We can go ahead and start doing, adding towards the bottom of our chain. Let's see what this is. What is this even? I don't even know what this one's supposed to be doing. Oh, right, okay, I see. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this node. Let's go ahead and at the bottom of the chain, I'm usually going to be adding anything that's really heavy to my image, and anything that is going to be applied to the entire image, or I want it to be applied to the entire image. So one of those things that I might want is the doing my depth of field, right? So using my Z pass to do the depth of field. So the depth of field is going to be using something called a Z defocus node, right? So let's go ahead and just grab my bottom of my chain. I'm going to type in Z defocus. Okay. And so the Z defocus node, what it's going to want is it's going to want a depth channel. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn those overlays back on by pressing Q so I can see it. So you'll see as I'm pulling this around, if I had a depth channel, or if that depth channel or Z channel actually existed in this chain, then what would happen is wherever I drag this focal point, it would bring into focus, right? So right now it's not doing that, which tells me I don't have a depth channel. So if my depth channel somehow got separated or lost somewhere in this chain, right, because I'm like overriding and correcting and adding together images, what I can do is I can go ahead and shuffle in, right, or combine together like my current image with another input, right? So I can pull, I have this, I just brought my pass back down here, right? So just duplicated and brought it over here. And I'm going to take the Z depth pass out of this secondary input. So I'm going to take the A input and grab the depth pass out of it, right? And I'm going to plug this into my output depth depth attribute. So you can see there now it's starting to give me something. So you can see here now when I hover over something, it's selecting it. By default, the settings for the depth of field is not good. You can see it's kind of gross and ghosty like that, right? And that has to do with this math setting. It's essentially how it's determining the depth of field. So what we want to do is we want to turn this to depth. And so what that's going to do is it's going to give you a more realistic camera blur setting. So you can see that, right? And so with this, with a Z channel and changing the math to depth, we pretty much have what we want. We can, you'll see this focus plane is changing as I'm moving this around, right? And we can, just like anything else, we can keyframe that. So from this frame to another frame, we can change the depth of field. I would do that, but again, I have, oh, actually, no, let's do that on this one. So let's say I'm going to set key here, and then I'll go to frame 20, and then set the keyframe right there. And you can see in between these frames, it's changing the depth of field, right? It's got a really weird glitch right there, which I'd have to figure out, but you can see that happening there. Okay. All right. Delete key, delete, no animation. Okay. The other settings are the depth of field, so how far or how deep the focus is. So the bigger this is, the more things that are going to be in focus, right? Lower this is, the faster things are going to go out of focus. Size is going to be how intense that depth of field effect is, right? And then maximum is going to be like a maximum of how much depth of field you'll actually get. So this is really handy because you might have a size that works really well for like your current region, but if you have something that's super, super far away according to your depth node, then that node or that those things that are really far away might actually go super blurry or might get really blurred out. So we can use maximum to kind of control that. Filter disk is going to be, let's go ahead and change that. You see this circle right here? Filter type is going to be changing. Oh, let's set that to bladed instead. You can see now it's, let's change the, let's see, blades. I'll set this to 3 so you can see it's going to be a triangle. So it's going to be essentially the caused by the aperture of your camera. So this is more of like a realism setting. So it's going to be the shape of your aperture. Some people use custom apertures, like if you've ever seen this out of focus light spot that is shaped like the aperture is called bokeh. So custom shape. Sometimes you'll see pictures that people have done by essentially having those out of focus bright spots being a custom shape instead of the shape of the aperture, and that just has to do with them like using a special shape that like is in between the camera and the subject that's going to change the shape of the light coming through. But anyway, so you can add your own custom shape, but most of the time you'll probably be okay just using bladed or disk, right? So that's the depth of field in a nutshell. If you're using motion blur, we're going to use something called vector motion blur, or vector blur. Okay. So I'll plug this in and we'll take a look at this one. All right, so the vector blur pass is going to need the, let's go ahead and we have this read node down here already. Let's go ahead and shuffle in our DPD time pass, because I'm pretty sure it got disconnected in this chain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this read node over, and we're going to add our DPD time pass to our stuff. DP camera time. Well, it depends. I'm not actually sure which one this one. So let's see. We're going to plug this into DPD time or DPD camera time. Doesn't matter. All right. Actually, let's take a look at this, and we'll view what those look like. So DPD camera time has something. DPD time also has something. Okay, cool. All right, so let's just go back to RGBA. Go back over here, and we'll go and add the. Let's go ahead. DPD camera time. I'm taking the X, Y, and Z and adding it, and just essentially adding these channels to my chain. Right. So I'll come back down to my vector blur. And we're going to change this to my DPD time. And then you won't notice anything because nothing's really moving super fast in my scene, but we can increase the movement amount. So let's go ahead and increase this by 200, or actually 2000. Let's see if this, I'm just going to crank it up until I can start to see it. I'm probably using the wrong setting. Let's do DPD time and then none for UV channels. Let's see. Let me go ahead and pause it really quickly while I just double check my settings. Pause. Okay, I figured out what I did wrong. I essentially forgot to make sure I was using the A input. I was using the B input for this one, but there's no DPD time channel pass in B or coming down my chain. So I need to just make sure I switch this to A. There we go. So in this vector blur node, I'm just making sure I have channels set to all. UV channels set to wherever my motion blur pass is, so DPD time. And they have a Pixar RenderMan setup or preset, which is nice. And then I'm just changing the emotion mount and some of these other settings to kind of control the effect of the motion blur. Right? I had to crank up the motion amount because by default my objects are moving super slow, so there's like hardly any motion blur. But yeah, so those are mostly it. I think I'll have a follow-up video just for finishing and writing. Oh, one last thing. So these right here are called backdrops. So what you're going to do is press tab, type in backdrop. Right? And so this is just purely for organizational purposes. Right? Anything that's inside of it will move together. And then I can type in, if I go to the backdrop node settings, I can type in, like this is going to be matte painting. Right? So this is really helpful for once you get like really complicated setups, you can like a really big chain, you can easily highlight or isolate or organize different parts of your image or your compositing setup, so you can know where to go. So let's say this one's going to be like background matte painting. I can change the size of it. So let's set this to like 20. And appearance, I can change it from fill to border. I can change the color of it. So let's say we want it to be red, or I want it to be blue, whatever you want it to be. All right, so these are super handy as well. If you need to get anything out of it, just hand select those things, pull them out, and now they're no longer moving around with it. Another thing you can do is you can also select like a whole bunch of nodes, tab, backdrop, okay? And you'll see it automatically groups those into there, which is really helpful. Okay, all right, so be on the lookout for the next video, but this should get you started setting things up, okay?